Good evening. I hope and pray that everyone is healthy and safe. We all have a lot on our minds these days. This pandemic and the effects it has had on each of our lives is obviously something we all think about. The political reality and the transition to a new administration is something also on our minds. However, historically, as much as we are distracted, we never allow our worries to cause us to forget the land of Israel. So tonight we have the opportunity to hear from Professor Alan Dershowitz about the future of Israel and America in a post-Trump era. Fifth Avenue Synagogue member Larry Heyman will formally introduce Professor Dershowitz. And Larry really needs no introduction, as he is one of the pillars of our community. Larry has a multi-generational relationship with Fifth Avenue Synagogue. I believe it spans 5 generations. He truly cares about the shul. He worries about the shul. He invests time to ensure that the shul is successful. And needless to say, his support is vital. Also, people may not know this about him, but Larry studies a lot, and mean a lot, of Torah. He is a wonderful guy, and we are so fortunate to have him as a friend. And it's a privilege to call upon Larry Heyman to introduce tonight's program.
Thank you, Rabbi. Those were very kind words. I'm not sure they're deserved, but thank you nonetheless. It's good to be with you all tonight, and hope you are joining us, as the Rabbi said, safe and well. It's amazing to see so many of you here, and it's really a special treat for us to be able to welcome Professor Alan Dershowitz. Now, I've had the privilege to hear Alan speak in various forums, and I chuckle at the irony in someone proclaiming that Alan needs no introducing, when in fact they proceed to do just that, sometimes in quite lengthy fashion. Professor Dershowitz is a distinguished Felix Frankfurter Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School, and by some estimation has taught some 10,000 students over his career. Some may currently serve as U.S. legislators and perhaps are about to analyze another interesting and very improbable fact pattern. He has an incredible record for criminal defense and constitutional law advocacy, successfully representing a range of clients from President Trump in his impeachment case to his prodigious pro bono work and causes, of which I hope that our humble shul is today such an example, Alan.
Yes, yes.
Most notably, and as it pertains to our discussion, Professor Dershowitz is one of Israel's most impassioned and eloquent advocates in the court of world opinion.
Mhm.
His counsel on the topic of Israel and the Palestinians has been highly sought by successive administrations, both here and in Israel. He lectures on and has authored several volumes in support of Israel's legitimacy and sovereignty, including The Case for Israel in 2003, a cogent and persuasive defense of the Jewish state. It is a must read for anyone seeking a concise education on this topic. I'll take some poetic license when I say that Alan is a passionate and brilliant warrior dedicated to defending both our freedoms of expression here and for Israel's right to exist. No easy tasks, even in ordinary times. Professor Dershowitz brings his moral and legal clarity to these very vexing issues. We are so grateful that he can be here with us in remarkable timeliness to discuss the prospects for future U.S.-Israeli relations. Thank you so much, Alan.
Well, thank you. And of course, I'm the reason that you exist. You know that, right? When I was a first-year teacher at Harvard Law School, a young woman came to see me who was a student at Radcliffe, and she asked if she could work as my research assistant. And she was brilliant. And I said, sure, you can work as my research assistant. And she did. And then she got admitted both to Harvard and Yale Law School. And she came to ask my advice. And I said, well, I thought Harvard Law School at the time was a better school, even though I had gone to Yale. Why do you want to go to Yale? She said, well, I'm in love with a man who is an assistant U.S. attorney in Connecticut, and I really want to be near him. And I said, my advice to you is follow your heart. And of course, that was your mom, whose name at the time was Ronnie Feuerstein, and your dad, Alav Shalom. And as the result of my advice, she went to Yale, married your father, and you're here introducing me today. Talk about Bashert. This is a perfect example of Bashert. For me, it's a thrill to be speaking at your wonderful synagogue. I occasionally sneak in to your synagogue on Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah. I go to the competition, I go to Park East, but I have friends in your shul. So I come over because I love your chazan. He is beyond belief wonderful. I've heard him sing all over the world. I heard him sing in Auschwitz. I heard him sing in Israel. I've heard him sing, of course, and be a wonderful chazan in your shul. But I just have one question of the rabbi, and that is this. I'm generally more secular. I don't wear a kippah, but whenever I go to an Orthodox shul to speak, of course I wear a kippah. So my question is, since I'm speaking by Zoom, I guess I'm supposed to wear the kippah. So I'm wearing my kippah, which shows an American flag and an Israeli flag in tandem together. And so for me, it's a great thrill to be speaking in your shul, to be speaking about the future of Israeli-American relationships. I'll just start by saying that the Talmud, of course, says that prophecy ended with the destruction of the Second Temple, and anybody who tries to prophesy is either a fool or a knave. I hope not to be either, but I will give you my honest assessments of where we are, where I think we're going, what the pitfalls are, what the dangers are, and most important, what we can do to influence the outcome of current relations between Israel and the United States. And so this is a conversation. Thank you for allowing me to respond to your wonderful introduction. And now I'd like to hear the questions put to me, and I will try very hard to answer them all.
So Alan, again, thank you for doing this for our community this evening. My first question, can you just tell us when you decided you were going to be a lawyer, what motivated you to do all the great work that you do?
Well, obviously, when I had my bar mitzvah was Shoftim v'shotrim titein lecha b'chal shi'arecha tzedek tzedek tirdof. And as soon as I read tzedek tzedek tirdof, I knew my fate was sealed. I had to be a lawyer, and it was never enough for me to be just a trial lawyer. That's tzedek. I had to also be an appellate lawyer, tzedek tzedek. And so I always wanted to be a lawyer. Rabbi Zuraf, the rabbi of Brooklyn Talmudical Academy, called me in one day. I was not a very good high school student. And he said, Dershowitz, you got a good mouth on you, but a Yiddish cup you don't have. So you should do something that you have to use your mouth a lot, but not your brain. He said, I have two suggestions. One, he said, you could be a conservative rabbi, which was the greatest insult he could hurl at anybody. He couldn't even pronounce the word reform. Or he said, you could be a lawyer. So I wasn't smart enough to be a rabbi, so I had to become a lawyer. But I've been a lawyer all my life. I got in trouble when I was 13 years old, signing a petition sparing the lives of the Rosenbergs. I wrote my first letter to the editor against the execution of Adolf Eichmann. So, I've been consistent in my views for, 70 years. And yet people attack me all the time. Oh, you've changed your mind. You're this, you're that. I've had the same views of civil liberties, against the death penalty, in favor of due process. All of my life, I apply it to the Israel-Palestine conflict. I am boringly consistent, and I have been boringly consistent in my philosophy and policies all of my life. Many of my philosophies emanate from my Jewish heritage, obviously, and from my Jewish education. And even when I taught at Harvard for years, you know, other teachers would quote Blackstone. I would quote Rambam and the Saadia Gaon and commentaries on the Bible, and I would cite the Talmud. I would assign my students, you know, Talmudic issues. I remember once I taught a freshman seminar to 18-year-old kids coming right out of high school, and it was called, "Where Does Your Morality Come From?" And it dealt with big, big issues. And I remember once, and they were, you know, 80% of them were not Jewish. And so once I gave them as an essay for the week, I gave them the Adon Olam. And I asked them to write an essay on what it means, B'terem Kol and V'acharei Kichlot HaKol. What does it mean before anything and after everything? And I got some terrific, terrific essays. So, you know, my Jewish background has informed my lawyer's life from beginning until today.
Great. And you've been a big advocate for individual rights. Can you talk about, is that part of the Tzedek Tirdov?
Well, you know, it's because the Torah doesn't talk about rights. It talks mostly about responsibilities. It has obviously procedural safeguards, al pi shnayim edim yakum davar, 2 witnesses, confrontation, warnings. There's a lot of substantive criminal law in the Torah, but my individual rights probably comes more from being a post-Holocaust child. I mean, I grew up in Borough Park in the 1940s and 50s. We saw people with the numbers on their arms. We saw children who didn't have parents. And then few years later, just 10 years later, refugees from the Hungarian Revolution came to Borough Park, and we met them. And so for me, individual rights has always been a key to my commitment to liberty and to justice. And of course, you know, the Torah and the Talmud, they're the first books, particularly the Talmud, is the first book ever in religious liturgy and religious writings that ever preserved dissenting opinions. While Christians and Muslims were burning dissenters, we were honoring them. If you lost a debate in the Talmud, or if it came out teku or it was a tie, your dissenting opinion was preserved. Sanhedrin says that, you know, if a Sanhedrin was unanimous in sentencing somebody to death in one night without there being an opportunity for other views to be heard, we negate that rule. So I think dissent has always been an important part of Jewish tradition, and I've been a dissenter for most of my life.
So, Alan, before we go to Israel, which is the focus tonight, can you talk a little bit, or you know, this has been a really strange week. Not getting political, the President of the United States has shut off social media. They're starting to shut other people off social media. Can you talk a little bit about individual rights and where you think we're at?
Oh, sure. No, this has been a very bad couple of weeks for the Constitution. I'm writing a new book on it as to whether we can repair our broken Constitution. Look, I'm not getting political, but I can't defend President Trump's speech in Washington, D.C. I thought it was ill-advised, but it was constitutionally protected. And it would be unconstitutional to continue impeachment proceedings against citizen Trump, that is not President Trump, but Mr. Trump, the day he leaves office. Obviously, I have been speaking to many people about that. I've been on television. I've had calls from the White House. I did speak to the president today about the Middle East largely. He did tell me, and please don't spread this all around, but this is a small gathering. He did suggest to me that he was hoping to get one more country to create a kind of normalization with Israel before he left. And here you have a president who's under such tremendous pressure. They've impeached him. They're trying to remove him. They're trying to investigate him in New York and indict him. And he's still interested in Israel. And, you know, I had the great honor of working with his Israel team. I went to the White House when the peace plan was being proposed. And I spent several days there with Jared Kushner and with Avi Berkowitz and with other people on his team. I was on the phone today with David Friedman. I was on the phone 2 days ago with Bibi Netanyahu. I'm deeply, deeply involved. I've advised, presidents on the Middle East as long as I can remember, starting with Jimmy Carter, who didn't take my advice, Barack Obama, who said he was going to take my advice, but didn't, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and of course, President Trump, who I've spoken to extensively about the Middle East. The first time I ever met President Bush, I was having dinner with my friend Chris Ruddy at the Mar-a-Lago. He's a member of the club, and Chris is the head of Newsmax, and I'm a Newsmax contributor. And we were sitting and having a peaceful dinner at Mar-a-Lago. We didn't know whether the president would be there or not. And he walked in and walked past our table, and he looked at me and he took a sharp right turn and said, "You, I want to talk to." And he calls me over on the side and said, "They tell me you know Bibi." And I said, "Well, I've only known him since he's 23 years old. We met, I think, during the 25th anniversary of Israel in 1973. And, we are close personal friends. I have never been to Israel in modern times without going to his home for dinner. And he's had to come to my home for dinner. And we just, every year when he comes to the UN, I'm there, and I usually we have dinner. Usually there's a family dinner, and my wife and I are the only people. I'll tell you an interesting story about that. So the first time he came to the UN to speak, he invited me to dinner when it was a Shabbat dinner. It was Friday night in a hotel, and surrounding were his family, none of whom are religious. So he said, "Alan, you're the closest thing we have today to somebody who knows." He says, "Would you do a little Dvar Torah?" And it was in September. So I did my Dvar Torah. I said the first Rashi is a very unusual Rashi. Rashi quotes Rabbi Yitzchak saying, "Why does the Torah begin with stories of creation? Why doesn't it's a law book? Why doesn't it begin, obviously, with the first mitzvah or the first Avera?" And I said, and the Rashi answers in the name of another rabbi, that the reason is God wanted to send a clear message to the world that if you ever question God's allocation of the land to Eretz Israel, you can quote this. And of course, I said that, and I quoted the verse. 2 days later, Bibi's at the UN using that story, of course, and he loved that story. And it's, of course, a very, very powerful story. You can either accept it religiously, or you can accept it in a secular way, seeing this is how long the Jewish people have loved and claimed the right to have a nation state for the Jewish people in Israel. It goes back, obviously, to the Torah. It goes back to Rashi. It goes back to the Talmud. It goes back throughout our Jewish history.
So Alan, can you tell us a little bit about at what age did you become passionate about Israel, and maybe was there a mentor? This week we lost Sheldon Edelman, who was a great supporter of Israel, so I'm sure you knew. But if you can talk about how you got inspired about Israel.
Sure. I've always been a Zionist. When I was a kid, we had a club, and I was like 8 years old, and our club was called the Palmach. I still have a picture of myself wearing the Palmach shirt. I can still sing the Palmach song. Rishonim tamid anachnu tamid anu ha-Palmach mimatula. You didn't pay me to sing. You're not paying me, but you didn't ask me to sing. But mimatula Negev. So I've always been a passionate Zionist. When I went to I went to Camp Masad in 1948, a very significant year. I was in Camp Masad in July and August, the year Israel established independence and was surrounded by its enemies. And guess who the counselor was in our division head? It was a young man a few years older than me named Noam Chomsky. And he was our counselor. He was then a staunch Zionist, member of a Shomer HaTzair, a very left-wing Zionist, but a Zionist nonetheless. And, I remember cutting school and going to hear David Ben-Gurion speak. Maybe, I think it was in Central Park when he came to America with his thick accent. He was impossible to hear, but we wanted to see him at least. So I've always been a staunch Zionist. It's been part of my experience. When I went to Harvard in 1964, there was no need for Zionism. Everybody loved Israel. Nobody hated Israel. Israel was like Sara Lee. Who doesn't like Sara Lee? Everybody liked Sara Lee. Then came the run up to 67. I didn't have tenure yet. And I was very upset and very concerned. It looked like Israel could be wiped off the map. And I started a a group of Jewish professors. I couldn't get most of them on board. Most Jewish professors at Harvard at the time wore crimson underwear. I mean, they were more Harvard than Harvard. Many of them changed their names. I remember once I collected for the UJA from a guy with a very Jewish name, and he said, "How dare you presume I'm Jewish just because of my name?" So it was not easy putting together a group of Harvard faculty, but we created, in the run-up to the '67 war, the Harvard faculty lunch group, and we expanded it to MIT as well. And some of the most prominent members of the faculty ultimately joined. And then one of my proudest moments was years later, just to skip forward, I helped to found the first Chabad at Harvard. When Hershey Zarki came to see me and said, "I want to start a Chabad at Harvard," nobody's listening to me, everybody's laughing at me, people with beards and payas coming to Harvard. I said, "I'm behind you, I support you, we'll do it." We did it. Now they're Chabads at every major university, not only in the United States, but around the world. It's been an incredible, incredible addition to university campuses. But I became obsessed with Israel when the left turned against it. When the Reverend Berrigan, when Bill Kunstler, when Noam Chomsky started to turn the left against Israel. And that's when I decided to devote a very substantial amount of my time to making the liberal case for Israel, the centrist left liberal case for Israel. And that's what I've been doing. But it's been very hard for me to do it, particularly recently. For example, I wrote a book, which is, I think, even more important than my book, The Case for Israel. I wrote a book called Defending Israel. And it's a modern version of The Case for Israel. And every year, whenever I write a book, and I've been writing a book a year, every year when I write a book, I'm invited by the 92nd Street Y to speak and promote my book, and that starts the book. But the 92nd Street Y canceled me and refused to allow me to speak, and still refuses to allow me to speak, because I was falsely accused by a woman I never met of having sexual contact with her, which I didn't do, and which I proved by her own messages, by her own emails, by her own admissions, by her own lawyer. But that's not the point. The point is the 92nd Street Y was willing to violate the Aseret HaDibrot by basing my cancellation on false witnesses. Temple Emmanuel did the same thing. And a local high school in New York, I'm not going to name it, but a local high school in the New York area that asked me to speak to its students and prepare them to defend Israel on college campuses, withdrew the invitation and canceled me as well, thereby denying their students the opportunity to learn from me how to defend yourself in college. And, you know, I'm not a modest man or a humble man. I think modesty and humility is often a falsehood and a lie. I am probably the best person in the country, able to help students navigate the difficulties of college. I've spoken at every major university in the world about Israel. I have debated at the Oxford Union. I've spoken at Berkeley. I've spoken all over. And yet, this high school refused to allow me to educate students after inviting me to do so. Fortunately, the Kushner School and other schools have now asked me to speak to their students. So this school is singularly guilty of teaching their students something terrible about the presumption of innocence and about evidence and about false testimony and all about that. But I will continue. But as a result of the false accusation, I can't speak on college campuses anymore. I've been canceled because there'll be protests and there'll be attempts to shut me down. And so my voice has been somewhat silenced. And I can understand that when non-Jews on university campuses try to silence my voice. What I cannot understand is when Jewish organizations try to cancel my voice on Israel. But that's the reality, and it's a scandal and a shanda, and it's wrong.
Well, the reality is we're in the midst of a renovation, and we're rebuilding the shul to renovate it so you can come speak at Fifth Avenue whenever you want on every new book. So don't worry about 92nd Street Y, Temple Emmanuel. We got.
Well, why don't you compete with the 92nd Street Y and set up a speaker series and invite people? You'll be like Rumble is to Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. They're shutting down speakers now. The Fifth Avenue Synagogue can become the marketplace where people who support Israel and can come and speak without being censored. I accept.
Okay, you're preaching to the choir. Thank you for accepting.
Sure.
So tonight's topic is post-Trump era Israel. So why don't we jump into it?
Sure. Look, Nobody knows. As I said, prophecy ended. There's never been a president more supportive of Israel than Donald Trump. I'm not a Trump supporter. I'm a liberal Democrat. I voted for Hillary Clinton. The only person who knows who I voted for in this election is my wife, and I'm not going to tell anybody, but nobody has done more for Israel. I worked with the president and his team on the peace process. I was there for the opening of the Jerusalem embassy. I gave the president advice. I'll tell you what the advice was. I can't ever tell you what the president told me, but I can tell you what I told him. He called me about the Golan Heights, and he said, what should I do in the Golan Heights? I said, Mr. President, have you ever heard of a country capturing a battleship during a war, a battleship that was firing on its civilians, capturing the battleship, and then giving the battleship back before there was total peace? He said, of course not, that would be ridiculous. I said, that's what the Golan Heights is. It's a battleship. If you've been to the Golan Heights before the '67 war, you know it was a plateau from which rockets were fired at innocent Israeli farmers and fishermen and kibbutzim and moshavim. It would be insane for Israel ever to give the high ground back. And he said, that sounds right to me. I like that battleship analogy. And, obviously other people pushed him in that direction as well. But it's been my honor to advise President Trump on these issues. The normalization process that's going forward deserves a Nobel Prize, a Nobel Peace Prize. The people who engineered the peace between Israel and the Emirates, and Israel and Sudan, and Israel and Morocco, and maybe in the future Israel and the Saudis, and maybe in the future with some non-Arab Muslim countries like Indonesia, they deserve a Nobel Peace Prize, all the people who are involved in this. So we know the past. Now, what about the future? I've known Joe Biden for over 40 years. I worked with him closely with Ted Kennedy when Ted Kennedy ran for president in 1980, and I was part of Ted Kennedy's team. Ted was a very close friend of mine, and Ted was a very close friend of Joe Biden. When my grandson got into Harvard a few years ago, Joe Biden sent him a little videotape and said, hey, Lyle, great job. Now that you got into Harvard, be smart and go to the University of Delaware. It's a better school. I mean, that's, he's a funny guy. He's a nice guy. He's a sweet guy. He invited me to his sukkah. He had a sukkah when he was vice president. Chabad obviously built it in his home in the Naval Observatory, and his machatunim were there who were Jewish. And I made a little speech in the sukkah and made kiddush in the sukkah. He's a very Hamish guy. He likes Israel. Like most politicians, he has mixed views of Prime Minister Netanyahu, but generally admires him very much. Netanyahu is one of the most privately admired leaders in the world. People are somewhat afraid to say it publicly, but if you ask privately who are the most admired leaders, they'll mostly tell you Merkel and Netanyahu among admired leaders in the world. So if you look at his appointments, they're absolutely remarkable. He appointed as the Secretary of State, the highest, it's practically second to the president, Tony Blinken. Tony, as you know, his stepfather was Sam Pizar, who I worked very closely with. Sam was a Holocaust survivor who was France's leading lawyer, human rights lawyer. Tony has worked for every Democratic administration in recent years. There's a good place in his heart for Israel. On the other hand, he's an Obama guy. And therefore, I don't know where he's going to stand on the Iran deal. Wendy Sherman, who's the #2 person at the State Department, is also Jewish. But she was the craftsperson behind the Iran deal. And the Iran deal was a disaster for Israel, a disaster for America, a knife in the back to Israel. And I know that I had long talks with Hillary Clinton when she was running, and she had promised me that if she became the president, she would amend the Iran deal. She would change it. She would make sure it didn't have a sunset provision, which would almost be over now, a sunset provision if the United States was in it. And there'd be real inspections. And I'm hoping that the president does that and is not unduly influenced by Wendy Sherman and John Kerry, both of whom made the mistake of agreeing to the Iranian terms and giving them billions of dollars to spend on terrorism and defend and developing nuclear weapons, which clearly they intend to do. The new administration will be a little tougher on Israel on settlement policies. They will be asking Israel to make more sacrifices in the interest of peace. I strongly believe in the two-state solution as long as the Palestinian state is disarmed. There's no right of return. The areas that are the basic settlement blocks now, Ma'ale Adumim, Gilo, Efrat, Kikar Tzion, all of that, all remain part of Israel. The Trump plan had a brilliant idea for how to do property changes, land swaps, and I hope this administration will follow through. I'm going to volunteer, even though I've been on President Trump's side of the impeachment issue and have alienated a lot of Democrats. As a result of that, I'm still going to volunteer to work with the Trump administration on policy. I'm sorry, on the Biden administration on Middle East policy. I hope they will accept my offer, and I will try to persuade them toward a point of view that is supportive of a two-state solution that does not in any way compromise Israel's security. That's the key. Nothing can compromise Israel's security. And I hope we'll see that. I also hope that I'm told that some of the countries who were moving toward normalization with Israel wanted to wait to Biden to be elected to give him the credit for doing it. I don't care who gets the credit. Let's just do it. It's really important. And I think what the Trump administration did better than any previous administration is it marginalized the Palestinians. It said to the world, you no longer have a veto on Israel's relationships with the rest of the world. The rest of the world will come forward. And, people ask me all the time, who deserves credit for the Emeritus and the others normalizing with Israel? Is it Trump? Is it Netanyahu? The answer is the credit belongs largely to the Jewish people, to the Israeli people. The Israeli people have made alliances with them absolutely invaluable. They are so good at science. They are so good at technology. They are so good at healthcare. They are so good at agricultural technology. They are so good in intelligence. They are so good in their military issues that every objective country in the world wants to be on Israel's side. And I have to tell you, if the Biden administration makes the mistake of going back to the Iran deal, that will cement Israel's relationship with the Sunni Arab countries in the region, because they'll see Israel more than the United States as a barrier to Iranian hegemony and as a barrier to Iran developing a nuclear arsenal. The one thing that's clear to me is no Israeli prime minister. I don't care if my late friend Amos Oz, who's as left as you could get, if Amos Oz had been elected prime minister, he would not have allowed Iran to develop nuclear weapons or a nuclear armament. That is a 99% Israeli policy. Nobody wants Iran to develop nuclear weapons. The idea of containing a nuclear Iran, the way we mistakenly try to contain a nuclear North Korea, will not fly in Israel. And Israel will prevent it from happening no matter what it takes. The Israelis understand very well the Psalm that says, Hashem oz le'amo yitain, Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. God will give the Jewish people strength, and only when the Jewish people are strong will there be peace. We learned that lesson of history from the Shoah. We had morality on our side, but we were weak. We were not strong. We didn't have the military capacity to defend our most vulnerable people. The reason there will never be another Shoah again is because we have Israel. If Israel had been established, then it wouldn't have happened. And Israel must remain strong. And nobody should ever apologize for Israel's strength. Nobody should ever apologize for the strength of the American Jewish community. We are strong. We are a powerful group. We're a tiny group. We're 2.5% of the American population. It's impossible now to count Jews because, every non-Jew is marrying a Jew. The only people who aren't marrying Jews today are other Jews. If you look at everybody in politics now as a Jewish grandchild, why are we surprised? So how do you count Jews? How do you count Biden's grandchildren? How do you count Clinton's grandchildren? How do you count Governor Cuomo's grandchildren? How do you count, Trump's grandchildren? Trump's grandchildren are halakhically Jewish, so yes, we know how to count them. But how many Jews there are is impossible to know, but it's, below 2.5%. And yet we wield influence academically, economically, politically, and never apologize for that. We need to have disproportionate strength to our numbers in order to protect not only Israel, but to protect the Jewish community in the United States from growing anti-Semitism, both on the extreme right and the extreme left. And the thing that's most dangerous to me is the growing anti-Semitism on the extreme left and the toleration by some, not all, by some in the Democratic Party of the anti-Semitism of some of the people in the squad and some of the people who not only are anti-Israel, but talk about the influence of the Jewish lobby and all of that. So we have to be prepared to fight back and be strong. And we are going to fight back and be strong. I don't want to get into the politics of it, Jews as Democrats, Jews as Republicans. People ask me all the time, how can I still be a Democrat in light of what Israel is doing? How Israel is being treated by the hard left. For me, it's an easy question. I want to remain within the Democratic Party to try to influence the Democratic Party to marginalize the extreme left and to not let them dominate and take over. When the Democrats came close to nominating as the head of their party, the chairman of their party, a person who had a long history of anti-Semitic associations with Farrakhan, I threatened to quit the party, but he was not elected. And so, they can't take for granted my vote, your vote, Jewish votes. But, I'm hoping the Democratic Party will retain its centrist element, which has always been pro-Israel. I remember when Hubert Humphrey, who was the Democratic candidate for president in 1968, when Hubert Humphrey was a very, very close friend of Arthur Goldberg, and I worked as a law clerk to Arthur Goldberg, and I think they were together in Israel, but at least I know the story. Hubert Humphrey, it was after the Six-Day War, during the War of Attrition. Hubert Humphrey was in Israel, and jets flew over, and he turned to Goldberg and said, "Are they ours or theirs?" Associating himself, ours, with Israel. Those were the days when all liberal Democrats were completely supportive of Israel. We're losing those days because many of the young people today, many young Jewish people today in colleges and universities are not supportive of Israel. So we have to fight that battle.
So you brought up the university. So you're a professor at Harvard. You've been teaching, I think, 50 years, give or take.
50 years, 10,000 students, right? Yeah.
So what's it like at Harvard? I mean, I've heard, but to tell us is there a lot of anti-Israel sentiment, and tell us about that? Because
okay, most universities are approximately the same. You have between 10 and 20% virulently anti-Israel people on the faculty and among the students. You're never going to persuade them. You're never going to change Noam Chomsky's mind. You're never going to change Norman Finkelstein's mind. You're never going to change Students for Justice for Palestine. So there's that. And then there's an approximate same number of people who are very pro-Israel, and you're not going to change their mind. So that may be 35%, whatever, of the population of college campuses, professors, administrators, students. And there's 65% with open minds who either don't care about Israel, don't know about Israel, or aren't opinionated about Israel. And they're our target. Our target is to use the radicals as a way of persuading the centrists that Israel should be supported by people of liberal and conservative bent, by people who love liberty, by people who are anti-war. Look, when I debated at the Oxford Union, nobody thought we could win that debate. I was warned by everybody, you cannot win a debate about BDS at the Oxford Union. BDS was started at Oxford, and we won the debate. I won the debate at the Oxford Union because I went out to the audience and I challenged them. And I said, I want you to name any country in the history of the world faced with threats comparable to those faced by Israel, external threats from Iran, internal threats, terrorism, etc. Name a country in the history of the world faced with comparable threats that has ever had a better record of human rights, civil liberties, concern for the rights of civilians, and the rule of law. And I said, I wait all day. Shout out a country. I waited. Nobody in this large audience would name a country until somebody, as a joke, said, Iceland. I said, you're right. Iceland hasn't had an enemy in 900 years, and maybe they have fewer problems, but no country faced with it. And then I asked them the next question. Name a country in the history of the world that in 73 years has contributed so much to humankind, medically, scientifically, economically, technologically, in literature. There is no country. Compare Israel's first 70 some odd years to America's first 70 years, to any other country's first 70 years. Israel is a miracle, and it should be praised all over the world. I tell students that what they should do is every Friday, every single Friday, turn out a 1 page on 2 sides, beautiful cover, 1 page flyer. What has Israel done for you this week? Just summarizing what Israel has done for every person. I remember speaking once in Hamburg to a group of 1,000 lawyers, all Germans, maybe a dozen Jewish lawyers sitting there. And I said to the 1,000 in the audience, how many of you consider yourselves victims of the Holocaust? And the 6 Jewish hands went up. I said, no. Every one of you in this congregation, in this audience, is a victim. Why? How many of you have people in your family who have cancer? How many of you have people who have diabetes? How many of you have people who have Parkinson's? How many of you have people who have heart disease? Everybody raised their hand and said, how can you know that the cures for those diseases didn't go up in the smokestacks of Auschwitz? Jewish contributions to life have been so great throughout the years and Israel is the manifestation of that. The nation state of the Jewish people has contributed like the Jewish people have contributed. And the idea of being anti-Israel because you're on the left or liberal is so wrong. And I've devoted the last 25 years of my life to trying to prove that. But now I can't speak on college campuses because of this false accusation, which I'm fighting, I'm suing, and I've written a book about it, guilt by accusation. And I'll continue to fight, and I'll be vindicated. There's no doubt I'll be vindicated. I never met the person, never heard of her. But it's taken a toll on my ability to stand up for Israel, not around the world, interestingly enough. I spoke today, just before speaking to you, I did a Zoom call for an hour with law students in Bangladesh, speaking about Israel, because they're Muslims. And they wanted to know my views on Israel, the 2-state solution. And I told them things they didn't know. They didn't know that the Palestinians were offered a state in the Peel Commission in 38, the UN resolution in 47, 1948, 1967, 2000, 2001, 2007. They didn't know that. They were shocked to hear that. And so I can still speak freely around the world, but it's harder now for me to speak at American universities.
So I wasn't aware that you can't speak at American universities. I'm not up to date on the latest, but let's talk about that. In other words, in America today, you could make a false accusation against someone and they could be banned. How does
of course, when you combine cancel culture and the Me Too movement, there is no way, if you're accused falsely, people could just make up stories about you. In my case,
it's until proven guilty, isn't it?
Well, there's nothing like that. In my case, I have her own lawyer on tape saying she's wrong, simply wrong. You couldn't have been in any of the places she said you were at. I'm going to get her to apologize and withdraw her argument. On tape, her own lawyer. I have emails from her admitting she never met me. I have a book manuscript admitting she never met me. It doesn't matter. If you've been accused, you're guilty.
But what's what about all the lost time that you couldn't speak at universities? Are you able to go after people like that? I mean,
well, I am. I'm obviously suing and trying to vindicate myself and my name. I think I'll win the lawsuit, but I'm 82 years old. So, every year is a year that I'll never get back. It's interesting because when President Trump asked me to defend him, I said, Mr. President, the story will be Dershowitz, who's accused of, he says, oh, I know, that's such nonsense. I would never allow that to influence my opinion. Of course, I want you to be my lawyer. And, others have said the same. I mean, I'm not lacking for clients, but nobody wants nobody wants speakers who will generate people saying, we're not going to go, we're not going to come because he's been accused. So that's the attitude. The 92nd Street Y told my person, we don't believe it for a minute, but we don't want trouble. That's what people said during the McCarthy period. We don't believe it, but we don't want trouble. Shame on the 92nd Street Y. And I hope that people will put pressure on the 92nd Street Y. I will no longer contribute to the 92nd Street Y, and I think that that should be the case with others. And I can tell you, if Elie Wiesel were alive today, he wouldn't set. Elie was the most popular speaker of the 92nd Street Y. I was the second most popular. And Elie would not set foot in the 92nd Street Y if he knew they had canceled me. Elie loved me, and he obviously knew that I would never do anything like that. He would never set foot in the 92nd Street Y, and they're desecrating his memory by canceling me and not allowing me to speak to Jewish audiences. Because remember, when you speak at the 92nd Street Y, there's television all over, and it gets sent to synagogues and Jewish community centers. So they're banning me from speaking to Jewish venues all over the country.
Well, their loss is our gain. So can you, we talked about this earlier, but the new thing about banning people on social media, you mentioned the Me Too movement, but it's so easy to ruin someone's reputation so quickly. So, you know, as far as policy, like where can we go from here to protect people that they don't get, you know, ruined like that or blocked? I mean, this is very scary. I'm scared.
Look, some people deserve to get canceled and blocked. They've done terrible, terrible things, but there has to be a process. I've actually suggested in my book the creation of a Me Too court, an informal court consisting of former justices, judges, college presidents, rabbis, ministers, priests, people who have great reputations, and anybody who has been falsely accused can bring a matter in front of them, and they would sit in some kind of a judgment. The minute I was accused, I asked Harvard to investigate me. I wrote a piece. I don't think anybody's ever written an article like this. I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal entitled, "FBI, Please Investigate Me." I wanted to be investigated by the FBI because I knew, obviously, they would find that I never heard of this person, never met her. But the FBI won't investigate me. Harvard didn't want to investigate me because they said there's nothing to this. But there's nowhere to go to get vindicated. And I said to the 92nd Street Y, set up a committee, hire a law firm, have them look into this. I'm open. I'll give anybody anything. I've never refused to answer a single question about my relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Yes, I knew him before anybody knew he did anything wrong. So did Henry Rosofsky know him. So did so many other prominent professors, David Gergen. None of us had any idea he was doing any of this stuff. And then I was his lawyer. Of course, I would be his lawyer because I'm a lawyer for people who are accused of things. But I never did anything improper, legally, ethically, or sexually, or in any way. So I'm happy to have the whole thing investigated and looked into, but nobody wants to do that. They just took the easy way out. And for me, I can fight back. I have a thick skin, but I worry for Israel because it means that my voice on campuses relating to Israel is not being heard. When I was invited by Harvard to come speak, Chabad invited me. It was supposed to be at the law school, and they were afraid that there would be protests and attempts to stop me. So they had to move my speech off the Harvard Law School campus to the Chabad house so that there wouldn't be any attempts to disrupt me. That says something pretty awful. And look what else is going on at Harvard. They're trying to withdraw now degrees of people who worked for the Trump administration. I was on television this morning on Maria Bartiromo on Fox, and I offered to represent pro bono any Harvard graduate who has his or her degree rescinded for any political reason. So we're living in a dangerous time. We're living at a time of a new McCarthyism. I remember the old McCarthyism. I was the president of the student body at Brooklyn College in the late 1950s, middle 50s and late 50s, and I defended people who were accused of being communists, even though I hated communism with a passion. I was always a centrist liberal and an anti-communist, but that's the world we live in today. And if you have children going to college, nephews, nieces, grandchildren, they must be prepared for what they're going to face.
When you say face, you mean a lot of anti-Israel propaganda, you know, BDS, is that what you're talking
Right.
about?
And if they want to become part of the environmental movement, people will say to them, we have a litmus test. If you want to support the environment, you have to be opposed to Israel. If you want to support women's rights, you have to be opposed to Israel. If you want to support gay rights, you have to be opposed to Israel. They're going to get that, and they're not going to know how to respond. And that's why I volunteer my time to speak at high schools all over the country. I spoke at a California high school recently. I spoke at another event where high school students all over the country tuned in. I have to be able to educate these students as to how to fight back.
So do you feel that that schools are educating students, for this environment,
Not not enough, not enough. The Jewish high schools have to do more. They have to have moot courts. They have to have training programs. They have to give them, there should be a course at every Jewish high school on how to defend Israel. And there should be efforts to make sure that they have support when they go off to college, and to know the names of organizations like Stand With Us, like Chabad on campus, like Hillel, like others who will come to their defense and not have them alone. Because the one thing college students don't want to be is unpopular. The reason I wrote my book, The Case for Israel, it's interesting. It was about I don't remember now, the end of the 1990s. And a student came to me on the Aseret Yimei Tshuva and said to me, Professor Dershowitz, I need you to give me tshuva. And I said, what do you mean? I don't even know you. He said, I've done terrible things. I said, what? He said, I'm a very smart kid. I went to a Jewish school. I think he said, I went to Ramaz, and I went to Camp Ramah. I know I've been to Israel in a gap year, but I never speak up for Israel on campus. I said, why not? He said, I'm afraid I'll be unpopular. Nobody will want to go out with me. Nobody will want to be my friend. And that's when I decided that I had to write a book making the case for Israel in a liberal way, in a progressive way, in a way that was appealing to people of every political stripe. And it worked for a short period of time. But now that I've been banned from campuses, it's working less effectively.
But Alan, does it really start at the campus level? Let's say you send your kid to a secular school. Doesn't it start in elementary school or high school? I mean,
not elementary school, but I did speak recently, a couple of years ago, at the Bronx High School of Science, and at other secular high schools to make the case for Israel as well. I'm available once the COVID is over, or by Zoom. I'll accept an invitation to speak at any high school in the country about the case for Israel, and I hope people take me up on it.
I have a couple schools. I'll call you tomorrow.
Good, good.
But going back to Joe Biden, you have a relationship with him.
Yeah.
So that sounds like you're most concerned about Iran. Would you say that concerns you the most? The UAE deal, he can't really unwind that. I mean,
he can't, and he won't want to. He favors that. He's actually come out in support of it. He commended it, unlike AOC and others who attacked it and trivialized it. Biden supported it, and I think Tony Blinken will be strongly supportive. I worry about Wendy Sherman, but she'll be working under Tony Blinken, so I'm not as concerned about that. Look, the number of Jews in the Biden cabinet is absolutely remarkable. The Secretary of Homeland Security, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Chief of Staff, the Deputy Director of the CIA, David Cohen. These are all people with strong Jewish identities, and I hope their identities will manifest themselves when it comes to positions relating to Israel.
So David Friedman, you said you spoke to him today, but I understand he's not staying on with Joe Biden. Is that correct? Or
no, I mean you always offer your resignation if you're an ambassador when a new president comes in. So he has 2 more days, and then I think he's going to remain in Israel for a while and then come back to the United States. He is a wonderful man, and he's been one of the greatest ambassadors that the United States ever had to Israel. Just as Ron Dormer has been one of the great ambassadors Israel has had to the United States. The relationship between Israel and the United States has never been stronger, and I hope it will remain as strong. I haven't seen any information about who the ambassador to Israel will be, or we know who the ambassador from Israel to the United States is going to be, and I don't know him, but apparently he's very good.
Well, who is that? I'm sorry, the ambassador?
I don't know. You know, Israel has sometimes made serious mistakes and appointed people who had not been up to the job.
Sure.
But in recent years, they've had very good ambassadors, and I'm told the new ambassador is supposed to be very good.
So you don't see Biden undoing the embassy in Israel, which something like that? That doesn't.
No, I don't think he's going to undo anything. He's not going to undo the Golan. I don't think he's going to undo the embassy. I don't think he's going to certainly not undo the normalization. The biggest issue is the Iran deal. and he will seek some changes. The Europeans are now seeking some changes. We know that Iran is violating the deal at every point, and Israel may have had a little bit more freedom of action in relation to Iran under Trump than they will under Biden. That remains to be seen. But remember, Israel doesn't need anybody's permission. Israel took out the Syrian nuclear reactor against the wishes of President Bush, and it took out the Iraqi nuclear reactor and was condemned by the Reagan administration for doing so. So, you know, it's good when Israel has either implicit or explicit support, but it has to make its own decisions. It's an independent country, and its interests are protecting its own citizens, and it will hopefully do the right thing. Of course, Israel is constantly in elections. I speak to Bibi quite a bit. I don't take sides on Israeli elections, but you know, he's being indicted. He's being there are elections. It's a difficult time in Israel too. Israel has been a model to the world on getting the coronavirus out there, and I wish it came to the United States more easily. I'm 82. I still haven't gotten my virus shot, and I'm looking forward to getting it so I can come back to New York.
Oh, yeah, I didn't realize you're not in New York.
No, I'm on Martha's Vineyard in total isolation with my family.
Oh, good for you. Good for you. So Alan, we have about 150 people on. Would it be okay if I open the chat if
Oh, of
someone
course,
has
of
some
course.
questions?
Yeah.
Because we're near the hour, and I don't know, the rabbi's going to come back, and he might have a question or two.
Oh,
But
sure.
if anyone has a question, please, put it on the chat, and we'll try to get it in. The rabbi might have one or two questions.
Okay, please.
Rabbi?
Yes, Alan, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.
Thanks.
My father texted me that you and him actually went to high school together at BTA.
What was your
way
father's
back when in Brooklyn?
What's your father's
Harvey
name?
Babbage.
Oh, yeah.
Harvey.
Yeah. Send them my very best.
So I did have a couple of questions that you did answer along the way. It seems that to me that your position, what you assume, again, no one knows, is that the Abraham Accords approach and this wonderful thing that's going on in the Middle East has enough legs to stand on, irregardless of what the American position would be, or you just feel that the American position will continue to support it and advance it.
I'm getting a call right now from the White House that I have to take. I'll be back in 1 minute.
Okay, go.
You. 1
go.
minute.
Okay, we asked for an hour, so come back. If anyone else has any other questions, please feel the pros to the chat. Okay, I'll come right back. So next week, for those of you who are on, we have Dory Gold speaking Sunday at 11 a.m. I want to make sure I capture the title correctly. Why Israel is right to doubt that a new negotiation with Iran can be made to work. So that's next Sunday at 11 a.m.
Hello. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, sorry.
You told
But
the president.
there are priorities.
I
think the Talmud says that you have to always be willing to talk to the head of state, Dina Malchuta Dina. So I had to take that call, but I'm back with you now.
Thank you. Rabbi, you were saying?
Yes, Alan, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a couple of questions. One you seem to have answered, that in terms of the Abraham Accords and this wonderful new development in the Middle East that none of us expected. So you feel that the new administration will actually continue and support that because there are American pledges that made that happen. But do you feel that regardless of whatever the American position would be, that the movement and these new treaties have enough legs to stand on regardless of American intervention?
Absolutely. I think this is a permanent change of policy and approach. And I do think that more countries will come on board because it's in their interest. Remember, countries don't have morality, they have interests. And it's in the interest of the Sunni Muslim countries, even Bahrain, which is more of a Shia country. it's in their interest to make normal relations with Israel, and it's their economic interests, it's in their political, diplomatic, military, intelligence interests. So I think that we'll only see more and more progress. It will require Israel to make some compromises in dealing with the Palestinians, but Palestinians no longer have a veto. There was news today that the Saudis are getting nervous because the Palestinians are putting a lot of pressure on them, but in the end, they will follow their own interests, and I think they will. I think the Abraham Accords will go down in history as a breakthrough and something that will not be undone.
So
Thank
Rabbi,
you.
just from the chat, so one of the questions, Alan, came in, what can be done to neutralize the progressive left-wing elements of a Democratic Party and make them less hostile to Israel? Which you talked about a little bit, but what can be done?
Well, nobody's going to make the hard left less hostile to Israel. What we have to do is try to defeat them in the marketplace of ideas. We have to defeat them politically as well. You have to start thinking early about running candidates against them, of primarying them, and defeating them where it hurts, and that is in elections. And again, we're not talking about politics here today, but we're talking about the future of Israel. You know, it's very hard to beat a very anti-Israel Muslim candidate in the Michigan areas that have very large Arab populations. But it's shocking to me that AOC is as popular as she is in the Bronx and Queens and other areas. And you know, I do think the Jewish community should have tried and maybe can still try harder with AOC, but she hasn't seemed willing. I mean, the idea that she canceled coming to an event that honored the memory of Rabin is outrageous, and she shouldn't be allowed to get away with that without paying a heavy political cost. But you know, you who are in New York know better than I do, but we have to keep fighting back and making sure our voices are heard within the Democratic Party. Look, I think we didn't handle well the Georgia election. The Georgia election involved a Democratic senator who you know, a lot of people wanted to see the Democrats control the Senate, but the person running to win was the Reverend Warnock, who said in a sermon, these are his almost exact words, this is not paraphrase, he said, we saw Israelis shooting down our unarmed Palestinian sisters and brothers like birds of prey. That is a blood libel. And 200 prominent American Jewish rabbis, 200 American rabbis defended him and lied about what he had said. They didn't say he said this, but maybe he's apologized or repented. They lied. They didn't admit that he said it. And of course, many in the Jewish community in Atlanta continued to vote for Warnock because of the influence of these rabbis and Deborah Lipstadt and others who are highly respected in the Jewish community. I think we should have done more to make him understand how terrible the things he said were, and make him understand that we will fight back if he doesn't change his views on Israel. So we have a lot of work to do.
Rabbi, did you have another?
I'm not hearing you. Can you talk a little louder?
Rabbi, did you have another question?
Yeah, just one last question. We've been, Alan, we've been speaking a lot from the American position in terms of the change of administration. And as you mentioned before, that Netanyahu is a very powerful leader. He's been in a position for many, many years. Do you think that the lack of stability on the Israeli side in terms of the leadership could also affect how things develop in the Middle East going forward?
Undoubtedly. Israel is a very stable democracy, but you know, obviously it's a parliamentary democracy, so it can have votes of non-confidence. It's much easier to end the prime ministership of a prime minister than it is to end the presidency through impeachment. But Israel is known as a stable ally of the United States, and you know, I would hope that the stability would manifest itself in not only elections. I think it's a disaster that Netanyahu has been put on trial, for things that were not prohibited by the law. I mean, seeking better media coverage for his family and himself. If every member of the Knesset or every member of Congress were prosecuted for doing favors allegedly for people in order to get better coverage in the media, we wouldn't have a minion in Congress or in the Knesset. So I'm hoping that Israeli judicial system would see the error of their ways and would end the prosecution of Netanyahu. But even if it doesn't, look, Israel is a country under the rule of law. You know, the joke in Israel is that when a prime minister gives you his cell number, it's not necessarily his telephone. I visited Prime Minister Olmert in his cell in Israel. And the most amazing thing is when I visited him in his cell in Israel, he was being guarded by an Arab man. Imagine, people say Israel's an apartheid country. Imagine the former prime minister of Israel being guarded by an Arab Israeli. That's not the way apartheid works.
So you think the continued peace treaties with other Arab countries could continue even under another leadership?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Both under another prime minister of Israel, another president of the United States. I think it's the future.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, Alan, we asked you for an hour and we're a little bit over. And now that we're going to do a speaker series and bring you back, at least.
Of course. And
so,
if the COVID is over and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, if you don't mind, I'll come by and listen to the Chazan for a while and say hello to my friends and schmooze a little under the tallis, and look forward to all of you, and best to all of my friends. A lot of people who are watching are my friends. I still have a few friends left. The Trump stuff has made it harder.
You have a lot.
And I know I have a lot of friends in the shul.
You have a lot of special regards from our honorary chairman, Ira Renner, but you have a ton of friends at Fifth Avenue, and we really appreciate you doing this for us tonight. And we look forward to a follow-up.
Anytime.
Hopefully after Passover. Okay?
Great.
Thank you, Alan.
Anytime.
Okay, have a great evening.
Thank you. Shavua Tov, everybody.
Come back.
Shavua Tov.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Sure.